Welcome back to Talk Tensors, where we dissect the latest and greatest in machine learning research. Today we're doing a deep dive into a really cool paper, a portable solution for simultaneous human movement and mobile EEG acquisition. Readiness potentials for basketball free throw shooting.
What really jumps out at me is how they've managed to take everyday smartphone technology and use it for brain-computer interface research,
Yeah.
capturing both complex movement and brain activity. It's like they created this portable neuroscience lab right there on the basketball court.
Exactly. They were actually able to record EEG signals from players while they were shooting free throws, trying to pinpoint that readiness potential, the brain activity that happens right before you do something intentionally. But to really appreciate how cool this is, I think we should take a quick step back and look at how this whole field has developed.
Yeah, the concept of a readiness potential has been around for a while, actually. Back in the 60s, researchers Kornhuber and Deek were the first to describe it, but they were using these big, bulky EEG machines and studying much simpler movements, like tapping your finger.
So fast forward to today, and this paper takes that basic idea and throws it into a real-world dynamic setting. Instead of being stuck in a lab, they're out there measuring these brain signals during a complex athletic skill.
The implications are huge, think about it. Studying brain activity in a controlled lab is one thing, but capturing it in the middle of a basketball game, that's a whole other level.
So let's break down how they actually did this. They had 26 basketball players, all right-handed, all with at least 3 years of experience, each shoot 120 free throws, all while being monitored. And their setup was really clever.
Yeah, they basically turned two smartphones into a mini neuroscience lab. One phone had an EEG headset and a recording app, so it was capturing both brain waves and video at the same time. And then the second phone was running this AI-powered pose detection system called MediaPipe, which tracked the player's movements.
Hold on. For those listening who might not be familiar with MediaPipe, can you give us a quick rundown of what it does?
Sure. Imagine you have this digital skeleton overlaid on a person's image. Well, MediaPipe uses machine learning to identify key points on the body, like joints and limbs, and it tracks how they move super accurately. It's like motion capture, but you don't need all that fancy studio equipment.
So with this setup, they were able to capture both the brain prepping for the action and the body's precise movements, all out there in the real world. Oh, and they even added a wrist-worn sensor to get even more detailed motion data. Talk about a comprehensive approach. But how do they know exactly when the movement started, especially with something as complex as a free throw?
That's where it gets really ingenious. They keyed in on what's called the set point, the moment when the player's wrist goes above eye level. It's a classic coaching cue. And they use that as a reference point to work backwards, analyzing the acceleration data from the wrist sensor. That let them pinpoint the exact moment the free throw motion began, and by doing that, they could line up the brainwave data with the actual start of the movement.
Wow, that's really impressive. But the big question is, did they actually find the readiness potential in these players?
Oh yeah, they definitely did. They saw that classic pattern. A decrease in brain activity in the front and central parts of the brain, and it started about a second before the player started the throw. It's amazing to see this well-known brain signature showing up in such a dynamic situation.
Okay, so they found the readiness potential. But now the million-dollar question. Was it different for shots that went in versus shots that missed?
And here's where it gets really interesting. They actually found that there was no direct connection between how strong the readiness potential was and whether the shot was successful or not.
That's kind of surprising. You'd think a stronger readiness potential would mean a more accurate shot, right?
You'd think so, but this actually opens up a whole new set of questions about how we understand skill and performance. It might be that for skills that are super practiced, like shooting a basketball, the conscious preparation that the readiness potential represents is less important than the fine-tuned motor programs that you develop over years of practice.
So the brain might be getting ready for the action, but the execution itself relies more on muscle memory and those ingrained patterns of movement.
Exactly, and that's where the motion capture data comes in. What they found was that for some players, there were clear differences in their posture and how they moved between their good shots and their missed shots.
Like what?
For instance, players who kept their wrist lower relative to their hips right before releasing the ball tended to be more accurate. It suggests that even tiny differences in biomechanics can have a big impact on performance, regardless of how the brain was preparing initially.
So, for our listeners, what's the takeaway here? It seems like individual technique might be a bigger factor in success than pre-shot brain activity, at least in this context, right?
Yeah, that seems to be the case here. And it underscores how important it is to look at both brain and body dynamics together, particularly in real-world situations. That's the only way to really understand complex skills like athletic performance. And what's even more exciting is that this whole setup was portable. So you could study athletes in actual game situations, which opens up all kinds of amazing possibilities.
Now, before we move on to our novel notions segment, where we'll brainstorm some potential extensions of this research, let's take a quick.
This research really highlights what we call ecological validity in science, making sure our findings actually reflect what happens out there in the real world.
Right, because we can't always assume that what we find in a controlled lab setting is going to hold true in messy real-life situations.
Exactly. And that's why this portable setup is so groundbreaking. It lets us bridge that gap between the lab and the real world, which could lead to much more impactful and relevant findings.
Absolutely. And speaking of real-world relevance, one thing that stood out to me was the range of skill levels among the players. They had participants from like casual hobbyists all the way up to people with almost 2 decades of experience. Did they talk about how that variability might have affected their results?
Yeah, they actually did. They acknowledged that the range of experience probably played a role in the individual differences they observed, both in brain activity and movement patterns. It's like, comparing apples and oranges. You might miss some subtle but important distinctions when you're grouping people with such different skill levels together.
It makes me wonder if a study with a more homogeneous group, like, say, all professional basketball players, might show something different, like different patterns in the readiness potential or how it relates to shooting accuracy.
That's a really good point. And it highlights something important for future research in this area. It would be really interesting to see how the findings might change when you control for factors like skill level and training history.
For sure.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've talked about the potential impact of skill variability, but what about the limitations of the tech itself? Did they mention any challenges with their setup?
Yeah, they did point out a few limitations. For one, they only used a single camera for motion capture, which is super convenient for portability, but it's not as precise as using multiple cameras. You can get some distortion in the data, especially when you're trying to track movements in 3D.
Right, it's a trade-off.
Mm.
But I imagine trying to get clean EEG data while players are jumping and running around must have been tricky too.
Oh, absolutely. That's another limitation they mentioned. Head and body movements can create what we call artifacts, basically noise, in the EEG signal. It's like trying to isolate those tiny brainwave signals while someone's dribbling and shooting a basketball is kind of like trying to hear a whisper in a rock concert.
Yeah. Wow, that's a great analogy. So they must have had to be really careful with their data analysis to filter out all that noise and make sure they were really focusing on brain activity related to the free throw.
Yeah, they use some pretty sophisticated signal processing techniques to remove those artifacts and isolate that readiness potential. But even with that, they acknowledge that there's always a chance some noise could still be there. It's a good reminder that no research method is perfect, right? We always have to be mindful of the potential limitations when we're interpreting results.
Absolutely. Being aware of the strengths and weaknesses of different approaches helps us to critically evaluate the findings.
Definitely. And even with those limitations, this research is still a huge step forward in our ability to study the brain in action. The fact that we can now capture both brain activity and movement data simultaneously outside of a lab using everyday technology, that's pretty incredible. It's almost like going from black and white film to high definition color. The level of detail and richness is amazing.
I love that analogy. It really captures how far we've come in neuroscience research. Okay, so before we get too carried away, are you ready to switch gears and explore some novel notions based on this research? You know those thought experiments where we try to extend the ideas beyond the original study.
My brain is already buzzing with possibilities. Let's do it. Let's dive into those thought experiments.
All right, let's imagine we take this portable brain-body imaging setup and apply it to a completely different field, like physical therapy or rehabilitation.
Ooh, now that's an intriguing application. Imagine being able to monitor a patient's brain activity and movement patterns in real time while they're doing exercises or relearning how to walk after an injury.
It would be like having a window into their brain, wouldn't it? We could see how it's adapting to the therapy and fine-tuning those motor commands.
Exactly. We could gain such a deeper understanding of how the brain recovers from injury, and we might even be able to personalize treatment plans based on how each individual's brain is responding.
We could potentially spot those tiny movement errors that you wouldn't catch with the naked eye, but they could be holding them back if they're not corrected. It's like having an invisible coach inside their head, guiding them towards the best way to move.
And think about the motivational boost. Actually seeing their brain activity change in response to their effort could give patients a real sense of control over their recovery, like they're actively participating in the process.
I can see how that could be super empowering, especially for people facing really challenging rehabilitation journeys, like recovering from a stroke or a brain injury.
This kind of neurofeedback could revolutionize how we approach rehabilitation altogether. We could have more personalized and effective treatments, really tailored to each patient's unique needs and how their brain is recovering.
These are some seriously groundbreaking possibilities.
Hmm.
I mean, sure, it's all hypothetical at this point, but it's so exciting to think about the potential impact this technology could have.
And this is just one example. We could apply this portable brain body imaging to so many different areas like education to help students learn more effectively, or even in the workplace to improve training programs and productivity. The possibilities are really endless.
Before we get too carried away with our futuristic visions, though, it's important to remind everyone that these are just thought experiments. Exciting ones, but still hypothetical for now. You know, this whole conversation about brain-computer interfaces and readiness potential, it really makes you think about that age-old question of free will, doesn't it?
Oh, it definitely does. Like, if we can track the brain activity that happens before someone moves, maybe even predict that movement before it happens, what does that mean for our conscious control over our actions?
Yeah, it's a question that's been debated for centuries, and this kind of technology just adds another layer of complexity to it, kind of like those thought experiments about whether we're living in a simulation.
Right. And it's worth noting that the researchers in this study didn't actually find a one-to-one relationship between the readiness potential and the outcome of the shot. So even though we can see that brain activity ramping up before a movement, it doesn't necessarily determine what's going to happen.
That's a really good point. It suggests that there are other things going on beyond just that initial brain signal. Maybe it's like setting an intention, but then the actual execution of the movement is influenced by all these other factors. Things like muscle memory, what's happening in the environment, maybe even a bit of luck.
Exactly. We still have so much to learn about that intricate dance between brain activity, our intentions, and our actual behavior. It's a really exciting area for future research.
Speaking of future research, one thing that really impressed me about this paper was that they were able to use off-the-shelf technology, like smartphones, to collect all that complex neurological and biomechanical data.
Yeah, that's one of the coolest things about this work. It opens up so many possibilities for what we call citizen science, involving everyday people in scientific research and for gathering data on a much larger scale.
Like, imagine an app that lets anyone with a smartphone participate in a neuroscience study. We could gather data from thousands, maybe even millions of people all over the world. The diversity and scale would be incredible.
It would revolutionize how we study the brain. We could learn about how it functions in different cultures, environments, across different age groups. It would give us such a richer understanding of human cognition.
We might even be able to identify new signs of neurological disorders, track how our brains change as we age, or even create personalized brain training programs to boost cognitive function. The possibilities are endless.
And that kind of democratization of neuroscience research could have a huge impact on how we diagnose, treat, and even prevent neurological conditions. It's an incredibly exciting time to be in this field.
Well, that about wraps it up for our deep dive into portable brain-computer interfaces, basketball free throws, and the ever-evolving world of neuroscience research.
Yeah, we've covered a lot of ground today, from the technical details of the study to some pretty big questions about free will and the nature of consciousness.
We hope this episode has sparked your curiosity and maybe even got you thinking about the amazing potential of brain-computer interface technology.
And as always, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep diving deep into the fascinating world of science.
Until next time.